It'd be really interesting if you could go a little bit deeper into your conception of global development, and also what what is the importance of political engagement for the development actors in their constituencies at home, and how should we be developing that, this aspect that is slightly underdeveloped, if you will,
So I would say a
in
couple of things. I would say that so there's foreign aid and things that are adjacent to foreign aid, where Sweden or the UK or Romania or Canada or the multilateral system like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank or the EBRD, which is like, for folks in this podcast will know what the EBRD is, but it's basically the financier of the post-Soviet space, a little bit more than that, but for this conversation, let's stick with that. We're all supporting actors in somebody else's movie, right? We're not. So this is someone else's drama. We're playing a supporting role in someone else's movie. So we got to start with that. And the other thing is that ODA, which is the fancy term for foreign assistance flows, has been dwarfed by all sorts of other flows really since the 80s. And so we wrote a playbook and a rule book and a set of assumptions, and kind of our theory of change is like, well, there's like some theory of change from like the 50s or the 60s or the, and there's a whole, there's multiple schools of thought about this. But, in a lot of countries, even say from 15 years ago or 20 years ago, like if you look at the amount of taxes collected, like there's a whole field called, you all know this, domestic resource mobilization. Like, who wants to talk about taxes? I mean, it's like the most boring topic of all time, right? But it's a super interesting and super important thing. And if you have trouble sleeping at night, we've written a lot of reports on domestic resource mobilization at CSIS. And so,
As a
like,
Swede, I'm
yeah,
hooked
you guys
already.
love tax. You Nordic people love taxes and long vacations and socialized medicine. I know. So, and I do like ABBA. I'm going to admit to that. I'm going to cop to that. I've drove Volvos as a kid
Excellent.
and Saabs.
Okay,
So I'm
great.
grateful. So I like Sweden. Don't get me wrong.
Best friends.
Long vacations and socialized medicine and everything, high taxes and everything. I love Sweden. I went to the Volvo factory in Gothenburg. Anyway, so, but if you look at like the amount of, so I asked the tax czarina, that's probably a bad term, but like the tax point person at the fund. I don't know if she's still there. She's very smart. She's like the lead on tax systems for the IMF. And I said, like, what's the rule of thumb for this? And she told me like about, you want to collect about 15 to 20% of your GDP per capita or whatever it is to have like to pay for cops and troops and roads and electricity and healthcare and something like that. And so if you look at like how many countries is ODA, like more than like 1% of the GDP? Like, I don't know, like maybe 20?
Yeah,
Awesome, man. Like they're
five
super,
maybe.
they're F
Like
word,
yeah,
they're
very
F
small.
word countries, right? They're F word countries for the F word podcast, right? There's like, it's Afghanistan, it's Haiti, it's a dozen countries in Africa, and maybe like two or three others. But that's it, right? So really, the show isn't foreign aid. The show is something else. The show is like policy decisions by policymakers, or the show is foreign direct investment, or the show is private capital, or even local savings in a society, like local savings, or even potentially local capital markets. And some countries have become net capital exporters, right? And so I just would just say that so when we talk about foreign aid, that's different than the concept of development. And I would just say like foreign aid, we need to have like a lot of, so foreign aid is like, and this is like not Dan saying this, so like you don't have to believe Dan. Like the UN has a whole, they had held these processes. They had like the financing for development track. Then you've got the SDG thing, and then you've got the Paris Accra Busan global partnership. Like, how should we think about development? There's like three tracks. There's like, what are we doing at like the SDGs? How do we finance it as like another track? And then like, how do we do it? Or how should we think about the concept of development as like another track? They all say foreign aid's catalytic, like yeast, right? It's not the main show, but the way our rule systems, our assumptions, our theory of change, there's sort of baked into it a little bit that were the main. That's a long-winded answer, but I would just say that that's one thing. So development is the process of a country's political, social, and economic progress. My finger's on the scale of democracy. My finger's on the scale of markets. You need a functioning state and some kind of a social contract. And so what I would like is I'd like to have a world of democracies. I'd like to have a world where everybody's kind of sort of treated okay and treated fairly. And, something, I'm not saying everyone's got to look like Sweden or the United States or Romania, but I think we are, like, if you said to me, like, what an end state is, like, I'd like to see a multi-party democracy in mainland China. I'd like to see a multi-party democracy in Russia. I'd like to see a multi-party democracy in Iran. I'd like to see a multi-party democracy in North Korea. Now, that sounds crazy, and a lot of people who are regional experts are like, that is the stupidest thing you've ever said. But I don't know. Like, some people said about Japan that Japan was never going to be a democracy. They said, like, maybe Romania was never going to be a democracy, right? And that's not true. And people died in Romania so they could have they could have freedom. And they joined the European Union. So development is about, and if we think about like things like, okay, literacy, so some of it's about like health metrics, things like education metrics, some social metrics. It's about economic measurements. So I think the Human Development Index at the United Nations is a good kind of proxy for this. But ultimately, this is about the decisions of governments and businesses and society. And the other thing I'd say that I think is often underlooked, like the World Bank had some study maybe 20 years ago that said like something like 9 out of 10 jobs in the developing world are in the private sector. Now, not all of it's in the formal private sector, which for folks in this podcast don't know, formality is a really good thing and an important thing. People pay their taxes and follow rules and environmental laws, et cetera. But the private jobs, you're not going to, so development happens when people get jobs in the private sector and people agree to pay taxes to a government is a big part of, like, in my mind, of a lot of development. Now there's like resource curse problems of countries that have lots of oil or diamonds or agriculture or forests or something else where that social contract can't kind of come about in kind of like a normal way, but that's what we should aim towards. And so we should think about how do we support better governance. And so what I was taught is you want to have private sector growth and good governance. And with my finger on the scale of democratic governance and like less corruption and functioning rule of law and respect for property rights. And I don't know, it's like those are like the two things. It's like love and marriage, right? You got to have private sector growth and good governance. It's like a horse and carriage, right? Frank Sinatra's song, Love and Marriage, right? Right. That's what you need. Like if you said, like, what's development? It's like you need those two things to have development. So ODA and the DFIs and export credit agencies and all the other stuff, are kind of come in and support those two things,